Hello again. So this video is going to go over the notion that Jews have been expelled from 109 quote-unquote countries. I use quotes because most of the places they list aren't in fact, most of them were just towns and provinces. They weren't necessarily whole nations or kingdoms. There's a couple examples of that, but that's neither here nor there. The focus of this video won't be so much as to go over each date and location that these people usually list. I kind of looked on the internet. There's a couple random internet pages that go over, try to go over each of the places in some manner or fashion. I mean, for me, I'll just accept at face value that they all happened or whatever. I think the point really is to address why, and if it's a unique thing that only Jews have experienced persecution and expulsion in the world. And spoiler, that's not the case. Plenty of other people have experienced persecution, expulsions, etc. And that's kind of going to be the emphasis of this video. I do have my criticisms of the lists they use, and some people use 109 countries, and then there's this old book that has 1,000 examples of Jews being either expelled or just persecuted in general, which I will get back to later. But the idea of expulsion versus persecution, and if you're just going to count pogroms or times that some Jews have been massacred in history, I mean, that's going to be way more than strictly expulsion. And they seem to conflate a lot of times random riots against Jews versus just actually being expelled. And then again, the whole premise of these lists is usually to say well, they must have some reason to dislike and expel all the Jews, when there's plenty of examples of just Jewish people, some of it is because Jews lent money and they didn't want to pay it back, and then eventually the kingdom would, that locale would expel the Jews for a while, and then they bring it back in because they need that capital. So there was issues like that. But one of the biggest things you'll find in these lists is that most of the instances occur in Christian Europe, and obviously that's where historically most Jews have lived in. But I mean, there were other areas like the Middle East, North Africa, and I mean you'll find a little bit in there, but the vast majority come from Christian Europe, which just in my mind kind of lends credence to the idea that a lot of it was just religious bias, which can clearly be seen because they list instances in which the Jews were okay, you can either convert to Christianity or leave, because obviously the Christians viewed the Jews as kind of a religious threat if there's this whole community within a community that doesn't accept Christianity, Jesus, the church, and that was the foundation of morals and political power in Christian Europe. So that's just always something to kind of remember.
And just to quickly add, and regarding this topic of money lending, Jews were not the only ones involved, obviously, in this, and there are examples of other groups in Europe around this time who also faced this kind of expulsion and readmittance type of thing, specifically the Lombards from Italy, but there were other groups as well who were expelled from various places. And you'd frequently see if Jews weren't there involved in money lending, it was the Lombards, not the Lombards, the Jews, or whoever else, various merchant groups in general from across Europe. And even though they were Christian, they, were expelled for the same reasons, more or less. But even if we go into the religious area of, persecution, expulsion, I mean, obviously there were heretical groups that were, I mean, not only, forget expelled, just totally exterminated, like the Cathars, Waldensians, Lollards, if I'm pronouncing that right. The only difference between these groups and the Jews is that these groups were basically persecuted to the extent that they no longer really existed, whereas Jews kept up their community and way of life in some way or another. And that's basically the main reason why Jews throughout time have experienced so much, but the only reason they've experienced so much is because they're a long-lasting community, whereas other communities just died out.
And I'll put in the link. It's kind of gay, but there's this Reddit post that in our Judaism that goes over all the expulsions, or a lot of them. And he's just one guy. I don't know who he is, but he just went over some of them. And I mean, you could go through that if you want. There's this there's this other Stack Exchange article that also goes over some of it. Doesn't necessarily refute each and every one, but just kind of gives context and stuff. But as I said, that's not really the focus of this video. Although I do want to real quick also say that the whole idea of 109 countries, the country thing is super inaccurate. The vast majority of locales that they choose are not whole nations or kingdoms. The only instances I can really think of that in that scale were the Edict of Expulsion in 1290 in England, and then the 1492 expulsion of not only Jews but Muslims as well from Spain. And that's another thing that happens, that they sometimes list expulsions of Jews when it was expulsions of Jews and other people as well. During Muhammad's time in Arabia, they count that, even though Muhammad also expelled Christians. If you buy into that history, I mean, some people quibble over Muhammad's historicity or whatever. So yeah, England and Spain, and then I guess you could argue the Arab countries post the creation of Israel, the exodus of MENA Jews. if you want to count those. So those are the only like examples I can think of like whole countries really engaging in expulsion, and the rest just seem to be like either towns, provinces, cities, whatever, like small locations. But yeah, my main thesis is that it basically just sucks to be a minority, and you could see that time and time again with various minorities, not just Jews. And so I want to look at another group that is often called middleman minority, being the Chinese, particularly the overseas Chinese in mainly Southeast Asian countries, as well as Europe and the U.S., particularly in the U.S., even in Latin America a bit. You see that the Chinese were engaged in a lot of similar things as Jews, like they ran small businesses, they were oftentimes like moneylenders and stuff. Maybe not moneylenders, but yeah, they ran small businesses, sometimes just like worked on railroads, like in farms in the US and California, for example. But in Southeast Asia, you even see them rising to the top of various countries and even being involved in like various political activities and oftentimes even communist activities. I mean, now we like see the China as like a communist country, or at least some people do, like as a communist country, but even in other Southeast Asian countries, Chinese, for various reasons, kind of similar to the Jews because they felt like outsiders and generally minorities are drawn to communism, they oftentimes were also involved in disproportionately in communist groups and activities in those countries, which led to oftentimes resentment against them, which is obviously very similar to the Jewish experience. So I do want to give examples for Chinese expulsions and riots, stuff like that. So I'm going to get into that a little bit. So if we're looking at overseas Chinese success in Southeast Asia, you can refer to the book Essential Outsiders, edited by Daniel Chirot and Anthony Reid. It talks about how the Chinese, especially in Indonesia, played a vastly disproportionate role in developing the modern economy, and even compares it to Jews in Europe and says it was, quote unquote, more impressive than Jews in Europe. Obviously, that's just their opinion, but whatever. They're just saying that the Chinese played a big role in the economy. And the whole point of the book is like they compare the Chinese and Jews mainly. There's a couple other groups. Sometimes people refer to as like Koreans and Indians, Armenians, stuff like that. Just like groups that have immigrant communities around the world who engage in whatever like trade and stuff. There's more comparisons with Jews, the Chinese in various areas, saying that commercial skills and disposition, along with international contacts, made it possible for the wealthiest migrants to dominate certain avenues of trade. So just that in the economic realm, a similarity between Jews and Chinese. Talks about some Chinese expulsions from Manila in the Philippines and Aceh, I don't know how to pronounce that, in modern-day Indonesia, from various groups, the Spanish in the Philippines and the Muslim Sultanate in Aceh. So those are some early on expulsions and massacres of Chinese. And of course, you got to remember that, obviously the Chinese have had, like, probably for as long as Jews, if not longer, a homeland, whereas Jews, like, obviously have a long culture and, like, in the very distant past did have a homeland, and now I guess do in Israel. For the longest time, obviously we're a diaspora group, so we're basically at the beck and call, more or less, of whoever was ruling at the time. And even E. Michael Jones talks about this, would often go to like the church authorities or like the prince of a principality or whatever for protection against like just the peasantry, because at least the church or the prince like either had like a moral like justification for protecting minorities from like a religious point of view, like they shouldn't just be like outright murdered, or like the prince, like they were useful to the prince or ruler of that principality or whatnot. And again, the religious issue comes about, again, in the Philippines, non-Catholic Chinese were expelled, but if you were a Catholic Chinese, you were not expelled. There's a similarity with that in Europe in terms of the Jews. Like, if a Jew converted to Catholicism, more or less, they did not have this view that Jews were, like, ethnically different, more or less. It was more of just a, like, religious difference. The whole ethnic distinction became more of a thing in the modern period, especially when countries became like more secular. Like obviously a secular Christian and a secular Jew may not really believe in God so much, or the Bible, but there had to still be like a distinction between them just from like the history of separation between those communities. But anyway, just saying that religion played an important role. Like if you converted, like you were fine, more or less, as long as you didn't like revert back to Judaism or whatever. And yeah, again, not only like expulsions, but just random massacres of Chinese in various parts. That's again, like they don't really differentiate often between like an expulsion or a massacre. Like clearly, if people are getting killed in rioting, some people are just gonna like leave and flee. So, does that count as an expulsion or not? I don't know. It's kind of like hard to count. What I also found interesting is the whole idea of like, oh, Jews like run the media and like film and stuff. And like, again, I admit that there's definitely disproportionate involvement in that, but apparently Chinese did a similar thing in Southeast Asia and were influential in like creating schools and like print shops, early film, newspaper industries. The book discusses, like what I've been saying, that minorities attracted to Marxism and communism, and Chinese being disproportionate in communist parties in certain areas in Southeast Asia. And there were even like Asian royalty who would go to Europe and like, learn like modern forms of like technology, politics, whatnot. And they kind of absorbed like the anti-Semitic tropes from Europe and applied it to the Chinese just because of a similarity. And the whole point of this video isn't necessarily to say like Jews and Chinese had it coming. I guess you could kind of like interpret it that way, but my whole point is that like this just happens to minorities, like certain minorities. If you're like a decently intelligent minority group in a country, like you're gonna rise somewhat and people are gonna notice that. Obviously there are other types of minorities who like maybe they're not as like, I don't know, high IQ, whatever you want to call it, and people notice that and they like might move into other areas. But it's not just like this totally unique thing. So just keep that in mind. I'm not trying to be like anti-Chinese or justify anything here. And here are just a couple more stats from the book showing Chinese disproportional influence in certain Asian economies. But that's enough of that book. I think that's a really good book if you just want to look at like Chinese in Southeast Asia. But I also want to look at the Chinese in California and like the Americas in general. So moving on from the Chinese in Southeast Asia, in California, everyone knows that Chinese were present in like working on railroads, farms, etc. Even in Latin American countries, Mexico. There's a book called Driven Out, The Forgotten War Against Chinese Americans. That book goes over a lot of anti-Chinese violence, riots, and expulsions in the basically more or less California and some other states in the 19th century. And the book counts up to 200 quote-unquote roundups, or basically attempts to expel Chinese from various, again, not like the whole country or anything, but just various communities in the West Coast between only 1850 and 1906. So that's, I mean, if we were using the same standard that the wingnats were using for Jews through like, thousands of years of Jewish history, there was more, quote-unquote, or not quote-unquote, these were expulsions, technically, of Chinese in the west coast of the U.S. just in, like, around 50 years than in thousands of years of Jewish history. But, again, like, it's just nonsense to, like, use any of these as, like, kind of a metric. I mean, clearly the Chinese in California and other states, I don't know why I only focus on California, but clearly the Chinese in the West Coast, I mean, they were expelled, sometimes it was due to, like, gambling or prostitution or those kind of, like, ills. But oftentimes it was just like straight up, we don't like Chinese people because they're different, or they're taking the jobs, like stuff like that, which again, like obviously minorities, when they come into a community, I mean, more or less like pre-modern history, like you're going to have a bad time if you're a minority in any, religiously, ethnically, whatever, you're just not going to be well accepted. So you can look at all these examples from the book Driven Out. There's like a ton. I mean, the author lists like a bunch. So if you really want, you can look at that. There's also a book about the Chinese in Mexico. There wasn't as many expulsions I could like find in that book. Yeah, the book Chino, Anti-Chinese Racism in Mexico, 1880 to 1940. A big expulsion in Mexico happened between 1929 and 1931 in the Sonoran border with Arizona. It says here around 5,000 Chinese were expelled, so that was like the biggest community there that was expelled, and so that's just like a big example in Mexico. The other examples in the U.S. like probably didn't have communities like that big, and it's probably the same with the Jewish communities. Like it probably wasn't like millions of people. It's just like dozens here, dozens there, maybe hundreds, whatever. Again, those examples that people use, like they never really give too like specific of details, so it's kind of hard to tell like what the actual occasion is. So yeah, there are numerous like articles, books on the anti-Chinese movement in the U.S. I think that's the most solid example of a community that kind of like parallels the Jewish experience, and people have like written on that. So that's a great example, and people can look more into that. I do want to go into some other examples, mainly about not necessarily expulsion, but more just like general violence targeted at communities, which may or may not include expulsion. Sometimes just like rioting, massacres, whatever. Because some of the lists that talk about Jewish expulsion. Again, as I said, like it's not necessarily expulsion. It was just like, oh, there was a pogrom here, or like a massacre, a riot, whatever. So you can look at the African American community in the U.S. I know one source quotes that there were like thousands, I think like 4,000 lynchings throughout the history of like African Americans in the South, as well as some expulsions of black communities from, whatever, predominantly white communities in the U.S. And obviously, like, people who are watching this, if they're like far right, will just say like, of course, like they deserved it, whatever. They probably think the same of the Chinese, but I'm just kind of giving examples here. And again, I don't think black people, like, regardless of what you think of blacks in the U.S., I don't think they deserve to be like lynched and killed and stuff. But again, someone on the far right would just, call me a cuck or some dumb shit. But I'm just saying that there's, if you take, again, the metric, there's, thousands of these instances against black people in the U.S. in just one country of one group. And, they haven't been here for thousands of years. It's only been like a couple hundred or whatever. So it's, again, just using the same standard. I mean, by this standard, Jews have actually not been persecuted that much, like through thousands of years of history. And all they can come up with is like 109 examples or, 1,000 at the most. But again, that's not like really the point of this. But I will bring it to an example that I think the wingnats, the far right, whatever, will have a harder time is the example of Germans in post-World War II Europe. The largest ethnic expulsion in history are the ethnic Germans from the countries that, Nazis like invaded and like had more or less settlers go into to try to like Germanify, whatever you want to call it. I'm sure there's like a German word for it. Those nations and those ethnic Germans who were either there already or were moved there as for like settler purposes were a lot of the times just like, attacked and like murdered, but like straight up millions of people were expelled in the post-World War II era. And this has been noted as like the biggest ethnic expulsion in human history. So if they really want to take this route of like, oh, you've been expelled from so many countries, well, like the biggest ethnic expulsion ever in history was against, the master Aryan race. And I'm not justifying that. I'm obviously anti-violence, anti-whatever, but, if they use their same methodology, their same standard, they have to explain that. And, maybe they had it coming. I don't know, but, whatever. And then another example that's some of them might find kind of problematic on their side is the treatment of Christians throughout world history. Everyone knows that the first like 300 years of Christian history, there was plenty of violence and, maybe not expulsion. I'm not really too sure about that, but certainly violence against Christians. There's absolutely been expulsion of missionary activity and Christians from various countries, like in Japan. I know the Jesuits, people have a lot of conspiracies about the Jesuits, but the Jesuits have been banned and expelled from certain places. In fact, the Christian community, they're probably one of the most highly persecuted and attacked religious communities on earth, probably even more so than Jews historically, and certainly now. The most persecuted religious minority in the world now for sure is Christians, mainly in the Middle East by Muslims. And you could see like that's like consistent, like the top 10 worst countries to be Christian usually are all Muslim countries, maybe except for like North Korea and India. But again, like if we're going by this standard, like maybe the Christians should just keep their religion to themselves, or maybe they should convert to whatever other religion. Like, why do they have to, be a unique people? Why do they have to try to spread their faith? Why do they have to do these things? They could just, stick to themselves, not bother anyone, but I guess they deserve it. They have it coming. But obviously I don't think that, but you have to keep that. It's just another example essentially. So I think you guys get my basic point that there's just plenty of, persecution and expulsions to go around. It's not really like a unique thing. The main thesis is just that, yeah, it's not good to be a minority. I would say a lot of the examples they use are kind of faulty, but even if we accept everything at face value, it's basically just, Occam's razor, like, yeah, obviously it's not great to be a minority. And it's in the pre-modern times, like you're gonna get shit thrown at you. So it's really not that like interesting of an argument, to be honest. Again, I feel a little silly like doing this video because it's just like, if you think about it for like just a little bit, it just becomes kind of clear. Like it's really not that complicated. But I always want to give like counter examples in order to like portray a picture larger than just the JQ. Like they only focus on Jews, but when you look at the broader picture, everything else becomes kind of more clear, and you understand the little like JQ in the broader context of just like dynamics of like, I don't know, human history, human psychology, It's just not that unique of a thing. So anyways, that'll be it for this video, and I promise eventually I'm gonna do some stuff on E. Michael Jones and McDonald. I might do another video on the, or not another video, but I might do a video on the Iraq War. So stay tuned for that. Like and subscribe, share it with whoever, and I'll see you guys later.